Hi, I'm Andrew Roscoe from Civil War Digital Digest. Today I'm going to be bringing you 5 primary accounts from field officers in the Army of the Potomac. Field officers are lieutenant colonels, colonels, majors, and they have a really important position in the Army. They serve as that transition from the enlisted men and the junior officers to the generals that we always hear about. I want to thank the patrons today because it's only through their support that we can bring you this kind of quality episode. If you haven't thought about becoming a patron, you can check out the links below, and we'd appreciate your support. The accounts we're going to talk about today are Rufus Dawes' service with the 6th Wisconsin Volunteers, Elijah Hunt Rhodes' All for the Union, Thomas Hyde's Following the Greek Cross, Henry Abbott's Fallen Leaves, and Charles Wainwright's A Diary of Battle. The one I want to start with is Rufus Dawes. He starts the war as a 22-year-old captain in Wisconsin. He's actually from Ohio, but he's living in Wisconsin at the time. Raises a company which becomes Company K of the 6th Wisconsin Infantry, famously the Iron Brigade. Dawes' account is written after the war. It's a memoir, but it's based on his diaries during the war. Dawes is a really interesting guy. He's an abolitionist. He's very committed to the anti-slavery cause, and he really proves himself quickly within his regiment. You know, he makes major by the summer of '62 when the Iron Brigade starts going to its famous battles of Bronner's Farm and Antietam. And within a year, he's lieutenant colonel of the regiment, and he leads it at Gettysburg. And I think one of the best parts of his account is the charge of the 6th Wisconsin on the railroad cut at Gettysburg. You know, it's a really dramatic moment. The Union Army is in peril, the brigade is crumbling, and Dawes takes his 450 men, charges across a field, and at the loss of about a third of them, takes this very important position and captures a large number of Confederates. And Dawes does a great job describing this drama and really just how brutal the combat was, as men were dropping all around him as he's going. You know, his horse is killed under him, he's sent toppling to the ground, he gets up, he's running forward, he takes the colors at one point. It's a really, really cool passage of a really important moment in the opening day of the Battle of Gettysburg. The other thing I really like about Dawes is throughout the summer of 1864, as the overland campaigns going on in his wilderness and into Petersburg, you know, he's one of the only officers in his regiment who's not hurt. And this is an era before we can say that something was PTSD or combat fatigue or whatever, but you can hear in his voice the weariness that he's just, you know, he's so tired of combat, and you can tell that he's just waiting for his time to come. And it gets so bad to the point that when his regiment's 3-year enlistment comes up, he actually goes home and musters out with the men who don't re-enlist. The next account I want to talk about is Elijah Hunt Rhodes. Elijah Hunt Rhodes is this really fascinating story because if you've ever heard the Ken Burns documentary, The Civil War, it's quoted throughout the course of that. And it's interesting because Rhodes has the whole experience. He comes in as a 19-year-old corporal, and by the end of the war, he is a colonel commanding his regiment. He ends up commanding his regiment for about the last year of the war, and he has this really meteoric rise. He goes from corporal, he goes on to division staff as a clerk, he becomes sergeant major of his regiment, and then he ends up as an officer. He was a company commander and adjutant, and then went directly from adjutant to commanding his regiment. And it's really interesting to see this young man go from a quiet young man to this really confident officer. And along the way, you know, and you can see it in the pictures of this book, which I think is great, is that Rhodes is this fresh-faced young man as an enlisted man, but by the end of the war, he's grown out facial hair. You can just see in his face, he's thinned out. He looks like he's a hardened soldier. And I think it's really representative of the experience of so many men during the war. But it's just, Rhodes writes in this really engaging way. One of the things I love is he pays special attention to July the 4th. It becomes one of his big benchmarks. And he talks about his experiences over the last year at July the 4th. And one of probably the most touching things of his account is as he comes home. We read all these accounts of the war, and so many men never came home with their regiment. But Rhodes gets the honor of leading his men home. And it's really touching that he gets back home. The men have all mustered out. He's the last man to muster out. And as he comes out of the office being mustered out, his whole regiment is gathered there in civilian clothes and starts cheering them. And it's a really nice close to the war that, unfortunately for so many people, didn't get that nice closure. The next account I want to talk about is Following the Greek Cross by Thomas Hyde. Hyde's a 20-year-old Bowdoin College graduate from Maine when the war begins, and he actually comes in as the major of the 7th Maine right away, which is interesting. A lot of these officers, you see them start as junior officers and work up to being a field officer, a major, lieutenant colonel, or colonel. But he starts as a major, and actually because of the way the regiments rushed to war, he's commanding it for the first couple months as a brand new major. Hyde is a really wide range of experience because he, at Antietam, is the regimental commander. He actually is awarded later the Medal of Honor for his actions there. He gets ordered to make this suicidal charge on the Dunker Church, which he does, and eventually is driven back. In early 1863, he goes on the staff of the 6th Corps commander. First, it's William Baldy Smith, and then later John Sedgwick. And the really cool thing about his account, and I think the really important thing to put him in there, is his experience on the Corps staff for so long. You know, when we hear about John Sedgwick dying, it's his account. It's Thomas Hyde's account that we're hearing in that case. You know, Hyde's writing style is a little bit stiff and formal compared to the other ones, but at the same time, the breadth of experience he has. And then later, he leads his regiment in the fall of '64, and when they muster out, he goes home. He actually raises the 1st Maine Veteran Regiment, becomes their colonel, and comes back to the war. And he ends the war as a brevet major general for his action. The next one I want to talk about is a series of letters by Henry Abbott. And this one is interesting because he's the only one of these officers who doesn't survive the war. Henry Abbott is a 19-year-old son of a prominent lawyer from Massachusetts. He joins the 20th Massachusetts, which we now call the Harvard Regiment. He actually had turned down commissions as a captain in other regiments because he really didn't think that he was cut out to be a soldier. He really had lacked the confidence in himself. He saw his older brothers as more martial than he, but he goes into the war and he takes it very seriously, and he's really lucky to be under a set of very good officers above him who take the time to mentor him and train him. And really quickly, you start to see that he's a quick thinker. He actually is a natural soldier. At the Battle of Ball's Bluff, this disaster right at the beginning of the war, Abbott is the one leading his company when all the rest of the men are jumping into the river, drowning and stuff. Abbott keeps his head, and him and his company commander get a whole bunch of men across the river to safety on a boat. And throughout the war, you see Abbott develop into this really hardened soldier. He takes the 1st company up the streets at Fredericksburg, and they're just obliterated there in the street fighting. And at the Battle of Gettysburg, he takes over his regiment when his colonel's badly wounded. And he leads that regiment basically from then until the day he dies at the first day of the Wilderness. And I really love this set of letters because there's no looking back in old age and maybe making some edits or something. They're all in the moment. And he really, this journey, this arc he goes through is really engaging. And it's really tragic, too. When he dies, it's really seen as a tragedy. You know, the General Meade and General Hancock, these famous figures, know who Henry Abbott is when he dies. And they're upset and they're weeping about it, just like the soldiers in his regiment. The last person I want to talk about is Colonel Charles Wainwright of the 1st New York Light Artillery. His book, The Diary of Battle, is an edited version of his Civil War journals. Wainwright, as a field officer, or as an artillery officer, was able to keep this huge volume diaries. You know, he's a very, very dedicated diary writer. And the circles that he traveled at within the Army were much higher than a lot of these other men, so it gives a much broader view. Wainwright's also an odd duck for this group. The rest of these men you've heard me talk about are 19, 20, 22. He's 34 when the war begins. He's a bachelor. He's a gentleman farmer from upstate New York. He lives on a estate on the Hudson River. He joins as a major in the 1st New York Light Artillery when they're formed, and he quickly becomes the division chief of artillery to Joseph Hooker. And Wainwright is a citizen soldier. He's not a militia officer, and artillery is a very technical profession. Wainwright devotes himself fully to the cause. And what's really interesting is he becomes as professional artillerist as any West Point artillerist. And Henry Hunt, the Federal Artillery Commander in the Army of the Potomac, really trusts and relies on Wainwright. Really importantly, at the Battle of Chancellorsville, Henry Hunt is not on the battlefield. Chancellorsville is famous because Hooker really mismanaged his artillery there. He had sent his chief of artillery away, he had decentralized artillery, and at this critical moment in the battle, Hooker has been wounded, he has a concussion, he knows he's being beaten on artillery, and he calls back to the one guy he knows and trusts with his guns, his old artillery chief from when he was a division commander. Wainwright takes over the guns, and the rest of the day on May 3rd, they're managed much better. Granted, Wainwright's working in crisis mode, trying to stop a lot of damage, But it's really interesting to see that wide breadth from this guy, that he's commanding the entire Army's artillery in one battle. His account for Gettysburg is incredibly detailed, and he becomes the 5th Corps Chief of Artillery all the way to the end of the war. Wainwright has this just biting wit, though, and it's great. You can tell that he's elite, and you can tell that, he has a French cook that goes with him, but he is a professional, and that's what I really love, is the way that it shows that, it doesn't matter your class, your upbringing, it matters your dedication to your profession. And that by the end of the war, these citizen soldiers were as good as any West Point graduate, at least some of them were. So these have been 5 accounts from field officers in the Army of the Potomac. I hope you find their stories interesting and take the time to go out and read with them, engage with them, and form some connections on your own. I want to thank the Historic Fort Wayne Coalition for giving us the opportunity to be in this great historic space today, and we'll see you next time on Civil War Digital Digest.